How many wars can be happening at once before the news starts treating them like background noise? Because today's stories are supposed to be separate. Nigeria, Lebanon, Iran, Gaza, Britain, Ukraine. But when you line them up, the same pattern keeps repeating. Official calm, civilian bloodshed, and leaders pretending they're restraining chaos they helped create. If you only skim one headline at a time, today looks like a pile of unrelated developments. U.S. and Nigerian strikes are being praised as successful counterterrorism. Iran and Israel have exchanged fire again while Trump talks about a ceasefire. Israel keeps hitting Gaza and Lebanon anyway. In Britain, criticism of Israel is still being treated like a public safety issue. And in the background, Ukraine is still taking hits while the world's attention gets pulled somewhere else. But once you compare the reports, the story gets a lot less tidy. The same governments that talk about restraint keep expanding the war. The same officials who say they want peace keep relying on force. And the same media ecosystem that describes all of this as complex often leaves out the simplest part. Civilians are the ones paying for these decisions. If this kind of breakdown helps you separate the facts from the theater, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Start with Nigeria, because this is one of those stories that barely gets treated like a story at all. The official version says the U.S. and Nigerian militaries carried out coordinated airstrikes against Islamist fighters in northeastern Nigeria, killed a large number of militants, and struck a blow against terrorism. Trump went on Truth Social calling the operation flawless and describing one of the alleged targets as a top global extremist. Nigerian military officials echoed that language and called it a landmark success. In Meteli, people described a normal evening being turned into a firestorm. Children were outside, women were cooking, then aircraft overhead, explosions, panic, and homes reduced to ashes. One resident said he lost 4 relatives and couldn't even recognize what was left of his own house. The village head said he put together a list of 27 civilians he believes were killed, including women and children. A hospital doctor in Maiduguri said several non-combatants arrived burned, shattered, and traumatized, and that some died from their injuries. That gap matters, because the press release counts terrorists, the village counts bodies. And there's a reason this gap keeps showing up in U.S. air campaigns. The Pentagon's own oversight system has been weakened, staff who focus on civilian harm have been pushed out, and the people inside the machine are telling us accountability has basically collapsed. So when officials say these are surgical strikes, the question isn't whether they use the word precision. The question is who gets to verify the claim, who gets to challenge it, and who gets buried when the claim turns out to be wrong. The other thing the mainstream coverage tends to soften is the political framing. Trump has tried to sell intervention in Nigeria as a campaign to protect Christians from Islamist violence. But Nigeria's conflict is not that simple. It is a multi-sided war involving insurgent groups, state forces, local communities, and a government that has itself been accused of treating civilian areas as fair game. When American politicians reduce that to a clean religious rescue narrative, they're not clarifying the situation, they're laundering it. And once that story gets accepted, the next airstrike becomes easier to justify. Then the next one. Then the civilian deaths become a footnote. Now move to the Middle East, where the language of peace is getting louder, right as the weapons keep talking. AP frames the latest round as a serious escalation between Israel and Iran, with Trump urging both sides to stop shooting and saying a deal could be close. On the surface, that sounds like classic crisis management, but drop sites reporting gives you the part that matters. Israel bombed Beirut's southern suburbs. Iran responded. Israel hit Iran, and even after talk of a truce, attacks in Lebanon kept going. So when officials use the word ceasefire, they're often talking about one front, while the rest of the war keeps moving. That's the trick. Freeze one lane, keep the others open. Trump's position, at least publicly, is that he wants the fighting to stop fast. He wants the Strait of Hormuz open, gas prices down, and the political headache gone. Netanyahu appears to want something else. Continued pressure on Iran, continued pressure on Hezbollah, and continued military leverage in Lebanon and Gaza. AP presents that as a disagreement between allies. A more honest reading is that they're disagreeing over the speed and shape of escalation, not over whether force should be used at all. And here's what gets left out in a lot of the coverage. The blockade and the bombardment are part of the same system. U.S. forces attacked an oil tanker headed toward Iran. CENTCOM says it has disabled multiple civilian vessels as part of its enforcement campaign. At the same time, Trump says he wants peace. That contradiction isn't a side note, it's the story. Iran, for its part, says negotiations are not really feasible while Israel keeps striking Lebanon, and while Washington keeps squeezing Tehran economically and militarily. The Houthis in Yemen have now announced a renewed ban on Israeli shipping in the Red Sea, which means the regional spillover isn't slowing down, it's widening. And that matters, because every limited strike has a way of creating a new response somewhere else. So when Trump says stop shooting, the obvious question is, stop what exactly? The missiles, the raids, the blockade, the airstrikes in Lebanon, the naval interdictions? The answer from the governments involved seems to be, only the parts that inconvenience us. If you want to know what the headline version leaves out, look at Gaza. According to the reporting, Israeli attacks kept killing Palestinians even after the ceasefire language was in circulation. One article focuses on an 8-year-old boy named Jad Salman, killed in Jabalia. Another describes strikes on tent camps, apartment buildings, and civilians trying to survive the day. The Gaza Health Ministry says hundreds have been killed since the ceasefire deal was signed, along with thousands wounded. So the word ceasefire is still being used, but on the ground it functions more like a branding exercise than a protection for civilians. And it isn't just the bombs. Israel shut crossings into Gaza and blocked aid after the Iranian exchange, calling it a security measure. That kind of move tells you everything about how little the civilian population counts in the calculation. When the region escalates, humanitarian access becomes a bargaining chip. food, medicine, fuel, all of it gets folded into military signaling. There's also a dimension of this conflict that mainstream coverage often avoids unless there is a scandal it can't ignore: detention and abuse. One of the more disturbing reports in the bundle describes testimony from Palestinian prisoners who say they were raped and sexually tortured in Israeli custody, with rights groups and UN investigators describing a systematic pattern. That's not a fringe claim. It is part of a growing body of allegations about what happens when a war becomes so dehumanized that abuse is treated as discipline. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, the toll is staggering. Thousands have been killed and wounded in Israeli strikes, and even as Trump says he wants a deal, Israeli attacks continue in the south and around Beirut. That's why the AP framing that the two leaders just have different priorities feels too polite. It suggests a policy dispute. What's actually visible is a regional campaign that has become normalized enough for the deaths to be reported like weather. As we covered in the previous update, the public story is de-escalation. The lived story is attrition. Now zoom out, because the war is not only being fought with bombs, it's being fought with access, bans, donor money, and political discipline. In Britain, Hassan Piker and Cenk Uygur were blocked from entering the country, reportedly because of their criticism of Israel. Paul Holden's reporting goes further and argues that this didn't happen in a vacuum. It came out of a long-running project to push labor away from its anti-war wing and toward a donor-friendly pro-Israel political center. That article is doing something a lot of mainstream coverage avoids. It follows the money and shows how party modernization can actually mean speech control. That's the missing layer. The public sees one visa denial or one ban and thinks it's just a procedural decision, but when you trace the donor networks, the lobbying groups, the internal smears, and the way criticism gets framed as a security threat, a pattern emerges. It's not only about one commentator or one activist, it's about building an environment where certain opinions become administratively inconvenient. And this isn't just a British problem. Ireland has barred Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Italy's foreign minister has openly condemned Ben-Gvir's behavior. European governments are starting to draw lines, but even then they often keep the trade relationships intact. So the symbolism gets tougher, while the policy stays soft. That's why the headline conversation misses the real question. It's not just whether a minister said something offensive or whether a journalist got banned. It's why so much of the political class is still willing to defend the infrastructure around those decisions while pretending to oppose the worst excesses. And just to show how global this moment is, Ukraine is still being hit too. Russian strikes killed civilians in Kharkiv and Donetsk, while Zelensky is still trying to drag diplomacy back into the room. That story barely gets space when the Middle East dominates the feed, but it's part of the same news cycle logic. Some wars become permanent fixtures, and everyone else has to compete for attention. The big picture is pretty hard to miss. First, in Nigeria, officials are celebrating precision while villagers are counting dead relatives. Second, in the Middle East, ceasefire language is being used even as strikes, blockades, and reprisals continue. Third, Gaza is still being punished through bombardment and aid restrictions, while prison abuse and detention practices remain underreported. Fourth, the fight over public speech, especially on Israel and Palestine, is being shaped by donor networks, state decisions, and political gatekeeping. And finally, the same governments that say they want stability keep using the tools that guarantee the opposite. That's where the real story is hiding this week, not in the polished statements, but in the gap between what officials promise and what civilians experience. If this breakdown helped clarify the noise, like the video, subscribe to Daily News, and tell me in the comments which part of today's coverage felt most misleading to you. Tomorrow we'll keep following the same thread, because the next headline will probably look unrelated, and it probably won't be.